Good afternoon and welcome to the ACEC Research Institute's panel discussion in partnership with Accelerator for America on funding and financing for community-serving infrastructure. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping announcements. For the easiest view, move your mouse to the top of your screen and select Gallery View. This will allow you to see all of our panelists. Your microphone was muted upon entry, but if you wish to ask a question, please feel free to submit it via the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. If you require any technical assistance during today's webinar, please feel free to send a message to ACEC Education privately through the chat box, also located at the bottom of your screen, and I will be happy to assist you. Now, allow me to introduce the Executive Director of the ACEC Research Institute, Daphne Bryant, who would like to say a few words. Daphne?
Thanks, Maureen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first of 4 sessions that the ACEC Research Institute is delivering in partnership with Accelerator for America and the new Partnership for Infrastructure. The Institute was just recently relaunched earlier this year and is focused on delivering research and thought leadership for ACEC members and our industry at large. On behalf of the ACEC Research Institute and our many sponsors, we're excited to support this very important initiative. We look forward to diving into today's topic on funding and financing with our esteemed panel. So without further ado, I'm honored to introduce to you one of my colleagues at the Institute and your moderator for today's session, Greg Cohen. Greg consults for the ACEC Research Institute and serves as our principal coordinator with Accelerator for America and the new Partnership for Infrastructure. Prior to opening his consultancy firm, Greg served as the president and CEO of American Highways Users Alliance. He was a professional staffer for the U.S. House of Representatives Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Maryland and a former transportation engineer for the Maryland State Department of Transportation. So as you can see, he is well suited to guide us through this discussion today. Greg, it's all yours.
Thanks very much, Daphne, and thanks to ACEC Research Institute and the Accelerator for America. Our partners at the New Infrastructure Partnership are WSP, Meridian, City Possible, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and HNTB. We work together in a cooperative effort in a process led by the Accelerator, in which we spoke with elected officials and appointed officials from all over the country to identify local challenges and innovation. NPI then formulated into federal policy ideas that would address key themes, including sustainability, empowerment, and equity. And now we are starting that conversation with our lawmakers, with appointed officials, and advocating those policies at the federal level and building our coalition to ensure that the recommendations from the new partnership are included in future federal policy. As you can see, we developed 26 different policy recommendations. Today, we're just going to talk about a few of them, but I encourage you all to visit acceleratorforamerica.org to see all of the recommendations. The Accelerator has been a great partner. They've worked with local leaders from across the country, mostly mayors, and you can see that we are diverse in our approach, rural and urban states. We reached out to elected officials from both political parties and nonpartisan officials and really tried to get a lot of different experiences from local leaders. Today's topic, which we wanted to kick off this series of 4 webinars with, is one that I know is near and dear to every local official's heart and to every person who cares about infrastructure, and that is funding and finance. Funding and finance specifically in this case for community-serving infrastructure, or really local-oriented infrastructure. As we all know very, very well, the economic crisis caused by COVID-19 has cities facing very significant budget shortfalls. There's loss in tax revenue, and we need to align funding and financing mechanisms to meet these local needs. This is going to be essential to kickstarting an economic recovery And we believe essential infrastructure is going to be very critical here. The playbook includes 7, now I mentioned 26 recommendations, but 7 are specifically related to funding and financing. These are all to support economic growth, increase investment, and provide needed support for municipalities. And today's webinar is going to focus specifically from the experts on 4 of those 7 funding and financing recommendations. So I'm very, very pleased to kick this off with our keynote speaker, the Honorable Mayor Steve Benjamin from Columbia, South Carolina. The mayor is now in his 3rd term, and just from the very beginning, as you can see from this bio, has achieved extraordinary things for the city of Columbia, and beginning with cutting unemployment roughly in half, securing billions of dollars in new regional capital investment, including Columbia's Main Street, the Justice for All initiative to foster a 21st century police department, emergency measures and subsequent emergency management during the 1,000-year flooding crisis that occurred in September 2015. And obviously many, many other items here that are important. I'd like to particularly point out that Mayor Benjamin is a municipal bond lawyer, so funding and finance is his specialty, and he serves as executive chairman of the Municipal Bonds for America, and also that Mayor Benjamin was elected as Columbia's first African-American mayor in April 2010, and now is on his 3rd term again. So we're very honored to have you, sir, and I'll turn it over to you to discuss bond issuance and raising capital for infrastructure.
No, Greg, thank you so much. First of all, I appreciate you reading my bio just like I wrote it. It's always very, very much appreciated. I want to thank Daphne for leadership at ACC. Obviously, thank my friend Rick Jacobs and our dear friend and great leader Eric Garcia for their role at Accelerator as well. And this August panel that you pulled together, I have no idea how I scored the title of keynote speaker, but I'll take it and we'll do what we can. We know the unique challenge, and obviously we're all believers in infrastructure. We wouldn't be on this call, but the particular challenge that we're facing as a country right now, the greatest pandemic since 1918, the greatest economic disruption in an election year since 1932 or 1876, depending on which historian you speak to, and the greatest social unrest around structural racism and police violence since 1968, all wrapped up into a couple of quarters in 2020, and causing significant economic disruption. We watched I think maybe nearly 5% loss of GDP in the first quarter. We watched the American economy contract by, I think it was almost 33% in the second quarter. We're seeing some major challenges all across the country that puts us at a time where I think it does allow many of us, those of us who've been proselytizing for many years, but I think many more of us, to look at the very particular role that infrastructure investment might actually be able to play in the economic recovery that has always enjoyed incredible bipartisan support of infrastructure spending, but not necessarily the bipartisan collaboration to actually get to an end goal. We know that in this country, cities and states build over 75% of American infrastructure, and the incredible growth we've seen in our metropolitan economies, with now 85% of our population living in cities and the metro economies that surround them, 89% of the jobs there, and 92% of America's GDP tied up in these cities and metro areas that I was proud to represent as president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. We know that if we're going to work to restart the economy in a very thoughtful way that's balanced and benefits all, we're going to have to start making some very thoughtful and strategic investments in infrastructure. It's important to note that while 75% of the investment it comes from state and local governments, that some local areas local investment is even more profound, with 98% of infrastructure coming in some areas of water and sewer in particular. In our city alone, we've invested over $500 million with a plan that will eventually have us spending $1 billion in water, sewer, and stormwater. The multi-trillion dollar, $4 trillion muni bond market still, it's faced some major challenges. The tax cuts have made it a less attractive instrument, and obviously the bill also took away advanced refundings, which has been a challenge, and it's great to see bipartisan leadership in both of it, actually a bicameral fashion as well, while pushing for the restoration of advanced refunding. We all know that the problem is substantial. As we just heard, the American Society of Civil Engineers obviously not only highlights every single year that we get a D, I think maybe in a good year we get a D plus on our infrastructure investment, but we often take our eyes off the ball and recognize that our failure to close the infrastructure investment gap could also cost a loss of about $4 trillion in GDP, $7 trillion in lost business sales, and probably 2.5 million jobs by 2025 here in the U.S. The economic benefits also would be substantial as we work through these challenging times. We've all seen Council of Economic Advisors research that predicts that $100 billion in new public infrastructure would raise GDP each year by $12.9 billion. You think about that, with every $1 billion that we invest, we could create 15,000 new construction jobs. Every $1 billion. It could be amazingly a strong poll after poll after poll that we see, and obviously we see a lot of polls nowadays. But consistently, we see strong, deep, and broad bipartisan support for infrastructure and investment. A YouGov poll just a few years ago showed 71% of the public supports increasing federal spending on infrastructure, with 78% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans. I dare say that there are no issues, literally no issues on the American landscape that enjoy such incredible and broad support. I think I even have some notes on some NLC polling done this summer. We're also seeing a great deal of support for much more creative public-private partnerships. Obviously, as we all aggressively defend, as I do as executive chairman of Municipal Bonds for America, protecting the tax exemption of municipal bonds as the primary tool that we've used since the tax code was codified in 1913 as a primary tool we use. It ought not be the only tool. We ought to have as many opportunities that might help us highlight the benefits of combining the power of the tax exemption in the federal government and local governments, along with the expertise of private sector partners aiming to ensure high quality work with less risk in true public-private partnerships. It requires, of course, us to be aggressive and it requires visionary leadership. It requires us also understanding that public-private partnerships actually does mean public-private partnerships, that we're addressing broader societal challenges around everything from broadband to affordable housing, and really doing a deep dive using this awesome tool to get things done. As my friend Eric Garcia often references on election day in 2016, as all of us were focused on the presidency, voters from Los Angeles to Seattle to Atlanta to Kansas across Florida approved almost $230 billion in additional sales taxes. Folks who voted to tax themselves to fund ambitious transit projects to increase mobility and ease economic friction. It's important that obviously we support, and I think of all of our great partners on here. I have to call out HNTB. I just think they've done amazing work as a partner for Accelerator, helping us not only track opportunities, but the work that we've all done together. And I think the greatest benefit as an advisory council member of Accelerator for America is that it's help highlight some of these successes on a local level. Hopefully model them up for scale, and continue to remind our federal legislators as how important it is in the administration. I enjoyed working with DJ while he was there on what we could get done and get done together, but the role that local governments play and local leaders play in and those of us who inform and help counsel local leaders, is that our strength is in obviously making our processes more efficient. How do we speed up decision making, cut down the time it takes to finish projects, streamline things, obviously, but while keeping our eyes on quality and environmental stewardship and the like. But most importantly, articulating the values that help make cities great. Cities are meant to be platforms for human potential. We use these opportunities as we talk about infrastructure, not just to talk about ductile pipe and the like. But we want to talk about how you humanize this infrastructure that dramatically helps improve people's lives. How do you create new economic opportunities? How do you relieve traffic congestion so we get more time with our family? How do we enhance environmental sustainability to make sure we're good stewards of this green earth for our children and our grandchildren? That allows us to continue to build a local base of support and also reduce the political risk, attracts capital, and allows us to continue making these thoughtful investments forward. I'll say this and I'll wrap up my comments. Why is this important to all these things? Why is it important to our conversation today? The reality is that we're looking at local governments being significantly hit. I've finished 8 of the last 10 years with a budget surplus. We've never raised taxes in Columbia during my tenure as mayor. We've actually reduced our tax millage. But this year, like cities all across the country, we're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars in lost revenue to provide very basic services. If in fact the federal government doesn't step up and try to find some way to provide some type of an infusion of federal funds for fiscal relief, we're going to see furloughs of local government workers, where there'll be spending cuts, delaying or terminating planned necessary infrastructure investments. Cities, obviously, in the state and local category, provide the vast majority of governmental spending on infrastructure. And it's important that we recognize that the NLC, the National League of Cities, did a survey this summer. So 2/3 of city respondents are already delaying or postponing infrastructure investments based on our current situation, not finding relief from the federal government. So I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight this as we all advance thoughts with our federal representatives and with the administration. The importance of supporting local governments in this crucial time is so important. So we're in challenging times. I do believe that the amazing benefits of infrastructure investment can help us change the game and help us recover from these challenges more rapidly than probably any other investment in the country at this time. And I really just want to thank ACEC and thank Accelerator for allowing me to participate briefly with you all today. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I wish you could stay a little bit later, but I know that you have another meeting after this one. So we're going to let our panelists answer the questions. And if anyone disagrees with anything you said, they will not you won't be able to defend yourself. But that was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Next, thank you, Mayor. Next, we're going to move on to our next speaker, Stephanie Wiggins, who's the CEO of Metrolink in Southern California. Ms. Wiggins assumed leadership in 2019 after a career and history for working in a number of different organizations that actually fund Metrolink, so very good. Most recently, the Los Angeles MTA. Now she leads a 275 employee strong commuter railroad with a $793 million annual budget, covering 7 different commuter rail routes across 6 counties and 538 route miles in Southern California. Hopefully all of those are safe right now during the fires. Ms. Wiggins' vision is to create value and exceed expectations by prioritizing customer first with 3 pillars: safety and security, integration, and modernized business practices. So Ms. Wiggins is going to cover our recommendation number 18, which is increasing direct regional funding. And I'm going to turn it over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you to Accelerator for America, and really appreciated the keynote from Mayor Benjamin. I have the opportunity to highlight this playbook recommendation on increasing direct funding, increasing direct regional funding, that is. And so I wanted to give some context, and I actually think I will uplift some of Mayor Benjamin's points. As Greg shared in the overview, I oversee a commuter rail system, multi-county, over 500 miles, connecting communities is what I like to say we do. The average trip length from our riders on our system is 36 miles one way. So Southern California is the area of extreme commutes. And about 2/3 of our riders are traveling across county lines, from areas that are inland with more affordable housing to major job centers in the central business districts in LA County and Orange County. So mobility is not bound by city or county lines. And too often, sometimes the funding that comes down at the federal and state level is. I really appreciate the opportunity to highlight this recommendation because AFA and the Institute really are helping us meet this moment by providing a platform for these recommendations that encourage us all to innovate federal policy. So first, in increasing direct regional funding by working with regional NPOs, it allows us to spend dollars more efficiently by investing in a vetted plan that serves the region. What we know is that when we align funding and financing mechanisms to meet local needs for essential infrastructure, we know it's critical to kickstart economic recovery. We have a track record of doing that locally. The mayor just talked about cities across the country have chosen to be self-help and generate sales tax for infrastructure development because these are job creating opportunities as well. Part of that community serving infrastructure theme that AFA is elevating. I myself participated in a listening tour last week by our regional NPO, the Southern California Association of Governments. They talked about the overall pandemic impacts and recovery plans, but we were also able to spend time to talk about specific counties' focused needs. So our NPO just passed their regional transportation plan called Connect Socal. It's their long-term regional plan that includes transportation and housing. And this plan helps to ensure federal and state dollars are used effectively and efficiently. Once this plan is fully implemented, it will create hundreds of thousands of jobs, generate billions of dollars of economic activity, and help us meet our regional goals of sustainability, transportation equity, and improved public health and safety. So the opportunity, though, is to increase direct regional funding. Today, very little federal funding actually is allocated to the NPOs for distribution. Why we think it's important to increase this direct funding? First, the regional plan is already thoroughly vetted. Mayor Benjamin talked about the importance of local leadership in identifying investments, community serving investments. Well, all NPOs are comprised of local leaders from various regions. So they're vetted, and we know that they can accomplish the state and federal goals. So more federal funding should be directed to these NPOs. The regional plans also allow funding of regional projects that go beyond jurisdictional boundaries, and it increases the likelihood of these projects getting funded. The NPO helps break down geographic parochialism that can take place. It also makes sure that we look at the region as a whole and mobility as a whole. What we have seen, at least in Southern California with our NPO, is because they have a thoroughly vetted forum, because they have local leaders at the table, private partnerships, private developers are willing to serve as advisory members to the NPO. because it gives the private sector more certainty in identifying projects that have consensus and as a result are less risky for private investment. So putting decision-making in the hands of those who understand the infrastructure needs of the community best is foundational to this playbook recommendation. I think it's the essence of what you heard Mayor Benjamin highlight. And so we know that an effective regional transportation strategy supports a resilient and equitable economy that understands the local growth patterns. And what we find is the traditional way federal funds are allocated, they usually go to the states, and then they have to actually deal with the state bureaucracy, and they are not on the ground. They are not aware of the on-the-ground conditions where the investment can best be made. So we really think there is an opportunity to maximize the vehicle that we have with the MPOs. It's a more efficient delivery of the funds. It increases the local decision-making results, and it makes sense for the communities that are being served. One may feel, why would we do this? Why would we move with this recommendation in increasing the funding? Because obviously, if you increase the direct funding, there are those who may think, well, we'll have less control and less insight into priorities and less oversight. But we submit that oversight and prioritization would still take place through the MPO process. First of all local leaders are at the table. It's still available to be audited. And in fact, the MPOs are in a better position to really allocate funding that really addresses regional needs that are not bound by county or city boundaries. And they also ensure the public voice weighs in, as well as the community local official voice. Our Connect Socal plan ourselves was recently approved by an 86-member regional council that includes elected representatives from cities, counties, Native American tribal governments from throughout the region, and the general public, as well as the business community. So I'll just close with my playbook recommendation and just summarizing that really this is an opportunity to optimize the assets of the MPOs that exist throughout the country. We can optimize this asset through an increase in this direct regional funding. It's efficient, it's productive, and provides a mechanism to ensure investments with regional benefit. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, and I hope you can stick around for the panel discussion later and some questions and answers.
Sure.
Our next speaker is DJ Gribben, who is the, whoops, let me forward that along so you can read his bio. DJ Gribben is the founder of Madras LLC and non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution. Many of us know him as the former special assistant to the president for infrastructure, where he led the Trump administration's infrastructure policy, and I believe that position was created for DJ. So we're really happy to have you here, DJ. Prior to that, he served as general counsel for USDOT and chief counsel for FHWA, where he was really the brains behind what we call SEP 15 or Special Experimental Project 15, which was a really innovative way to test and explore new approaches to public-private partnerships and to really be able to do some innovative things without having to go through the normal, very long and difficult process. In the private sector, DJ is currently also the senior operating partner for Stone Peak. He's the former national director for strategic consulting for HDR and headed the government advisory for Macquarie Capital, and former volunteer as president of ARTBA's P3 division. So DJ, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
All right, Greg, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting this panel, keeping us all organized, and special thanks to Mayor Garcia's Accelerator for America and Rick Jacobs for providing the resources to pull this together, John Picari, the WSP team, for providing the legwork needed to get this published. It truly is an exceptional work, and it's a privilege to be part of this group talking about it. Federal infrastructure financing is very fascinating because, as Mayor Benjamin pointed out, most of the resources that are used to fund infrastructure are non-federal. And so what we have is a system whereby, Greg, I've lost the picture here. Can you guys still see me?
Yes, we can see you, DJ.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll just keep on going then. So it's an interesting program because the federal government can encourage innovation and creativity, but federal funding can also encourage status quo thinking. And it's, Ms. Wiggins pointed out, we have a system that was set up primarily in the 1950s with a vision to create the interstate, which it did. And unfortunately, a fair number of legacy programs still exist that are with that mindset. And so this playbook does an excellent job of taking an existing system and refocusing it towards the needs of the 21st century. I'd like to make two just global points when you're talking about financing, especially federal financing and infrastructure. And one's been mentioned already, and that is the distinction between funding and financing. When I was working in the White House, there was pretty frequently some confusion where people would think, hey, if we can issue bonds or get a loan or do these other financing activities, use public-private partnerships, that would create new revenue for infrastructure. And unfortunately, that is not the case. It's akin to getting a credit card in the mail that has a $5,000 credit limit. Good news is that you have $5,000 more flexibility than you had before. Bad news, you're actually not $5,000 wealthier. So there's a significant distinction between funding and financing, and I appreciate the playbook's distinction. Secondly, there was an interesting sort of dynamic in terms of thinking about federal funds versus non-federal funds. I would often have people say to me, listen, the federal government should invest more because states and communities can't invest more than they have already. And the challenge of that line of thinking is that every federal dollar is a community dollar. So the federal government can reallocate funds, the federal government can borrow very efficiently, but the federal government actually can't create wealth. So it's important as we think about funding and financing strategies for the future to understand that the federal government can play an incredibly important role, certainly has some efficiencies that don't exist at the state and local level. But at the end of the day, the federal dollars aren't new dollars that are additive to community dollars. They're actually coming from communities themselves. So I've been asked to talk about credit programs and refinancing, part of recommendation 16 in the playbook. And I just wanted to point out that this playbook is exceptionally well done. It may be one of the more detailed and thoughtful pieces on infrastructure that's been put together in a long, long time. And I want to talk a little bit about TIFIA and private activity bonds in terms of financing mechanisms. So expanding TIFIA is a bit of a no-brainer. It's low cost, it's long-term, it is very patient, it allows for backloading of debt. It is a phenomenal program that's been very, very successful over the course of time. And in fact, as part of the administration's 2018 plan, we suggested creating a TIFIA-like structure for every asset class that's governmental to allow both TIFIA and then to lift the cap on private activity bonds so that states and localities have the full range of financing tools when it comes to developing their infrastructure. TIFIA is quite helpful in three different ways. The scoring for TIFIA is particularly attractive. It may be the best leveraged federal program out there because of the way it's scored and because TIFIA can be used for 33 or 49% of a project's cost. That combination is particularly powerful. Also, the targeted nature of TIFIA and the fact that it applies to assets that otherwise would be eligible for grants makes it very attractive. That is that, the federal government will loan money, but then the owner of the infrastructure also has to put in money as well, which helps guarantee that those funds will be well spent. And then finally, TIFIA helps level the playing field for private investment, where there's not a distinction between the cost of capital, or there's less of a distinction, because if you have TIFIA, if you have private activity bonds, private participants, we've heard about public-private partnerships earlier, private participants can be competitive in terms of their weighted average cost of capital. So The playbook also calls for expanding TIFIA refinancing. And typically, if you get a TIFIA loan for a project, you can't refinance that loan unless you make a significant or notable capital improvement to the project. I think one thing that's important as we talk about finance infrastructure, and Mayor Benjamin and Ms. Wiggins touched on this, is we're currently in the midst of a pandemic. While there are a number of rules that would apply in a normal situation, I think it's important to be sort of flexible and creative, particularly in a time that we have today, where we're not only trying to recover from the pandemic, but we're also looking at what could be a significant slowdown in the economy going forward in the future. So I would just wrap this up with, again, thank everybody who participated in the development of this project. It's truly exceptional. For those who haven't read it, I would highly encourage you to give it a read. And as we formulate infrastructure policy, it's important to think about the federal government's role. It can be helpful. In some circumstances, it can be less than helpful, so we need to balance that out. But take that in terms of the context we currently find ourselves in, which is unfortunately pretty disruptive. So with that, Greg, I'll pass it back to you. Thank you again for having me.
Great, thank you, DJ. And then, our last panelist, last but not least, is Sylvia Garcia, who I've been working closely with. Sylvia is a principal consultant at WSP USA, which is one of the members of the National New Partnership for Infrastructure. She specializes in public finance policy, leads the planning, strategy, and grants group for WSP, and helps local and state governments with their processes, resources, and operations for their strategic goals. Prior to joining last year with WSP, Ms. Garcia had 15 years of public sector experience. I'm going to take the last one first because I think, this is great on the ground stuff, but she was the Chief Operating Officer and Chief of Staff for the Chicago Transit Authority. She also served here in Washington as the Chief Financial Officer and Assistant Secretary for the Budget at USDOT, and as professional staff on the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Appropriations. So Sylvia is going to discuss pre-development funds and technical support, which is the 14th recommendation in the playbook, and I'll turn it over to her now. Don't forget to unmute. There you go.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I really appreciate ACEC hosting this panel. It's a great opportunity to hear from a number of folks. It's always great to hear a lot of experts echoing each other and building on each other in this conversation. I really want to thank the Accelerator for America, Rick Jacobs, Mayor Garcetti, for creating this forum, because I think the development of this playbook, as DJ said, was a really thoughtful and collaborative process where we talked to mayors across the country and really heard about what's happening on the ground. As Greg mentioned, on my last stop in the public sector before my current position, I was at the Chicago Transit Authority, where in a lot of ways it was kind of like managing a small city every day of who knows what could happen and how do we make the most of what's going on the transit system. But the thing that really got me up every morning was the fact that if we did our job right, people got home to their families, they got to work, they got to school, and really making that connectivity, I think, is what makes infrastructure such an exciting area to work on. And so when I think about that, when I think about these recommendations, I'm really excited to talk about this pre-development funds and technical support in recommendation 14, because I think, as DJ said, so much of the funding that exists on the federal level kind of predetermines where you're going. And so I think because a lot of the focus has historically been on highways, been on construction, we kind of miss an opportunity to think about what needs to be developed. So in 2008 and 2009, when I was working on the Appropriations Committee, we were putting together the Recovery Act at the time. And at the time, there was our favorite phrase, which I think now is passé and no one wants to hear, but our project shovel ready, right? Shovel ready was the #1 criteria for every project as we were taking a look at what should be funded. I think there's a lot of lessons learned from that maybe because the project is shovel ready, is it really the project that needs to be implemented at that moment? And so what we've taken in this recommendation is that idea and turned it into shovel worthy. Is it really the project that meets the need for the local community at that moment in time? And so in a lot of ways, the way that we build that pipeline of projects that really are shovel worthy is creating some opportunities on the federal level to fund that development ahead of time, do planning, design, environmental review, those key elements that are going to build that consensus that Mayor Benjamin was talking about on the local level of what's the right project for us. So by providing some federal funding for these types of activities, you're really giving localities an opportunity to implement what they think makes sense, as opposed to which bucket of funding exists if you make this very flexible and meets the needs of the locality. So providing specific funding for planning, we know there's demand. The BUILD program, formerly Tiger, that came out of that Recovery Act in 2009, has gone off and on with planning money. I think in the last round in 2020, there was $1 billion for construction, 15 million of it was for planning, and it's always massively oversubscribed because there is so much demand on the local level to kind of think about how do we move these projects forward and how do we bring these components together. So we really think building on that, creating a flexible pot of funding is really important. On the flip side of that, I think it's really important that we think about capacity building and technical support. For a lot of these big competitive grant programs, or even just big projects in general, a locality that is small or medium size may be doing 1 or 2 big projects in 20 years. Whereas, you know, the know-how and knowledge that's needed to kind of get through that process is something that's kind of developed over a career. So frequently on the local level, there needs to be an opportunity for folks to learn how these processes work. The government needs to be able to provide a little bit more technical assistance and technical support to address some of those human capital constraints and the financial constraints on the local level. It's really hard to have someone who's an expert in every single federal program if you're a state or local government, if you're only going to use the program once. And so it's really, this recommendation is a lot about how do we harness that expertise that's out there and make sure it's available to everyone at all levels of government. So I think those are the highlights of this recommendation. I think I'm really excited to get to the questions, so I'm gonna jump there, but I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this, and I think it's really important that we continue this theme of thinking about social infrastructure and shaping it in what makes sense to people on the local level. I think that's what makes infrastructure exciting to work on. So thanks, Greg.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. And we're going to wrap this up in 15 minutes or so. So we're going to have an opportunity for questions and answers. And you'll see that there is both a chat box and a Q&A box. And I see that there's a number of questions in both the chat box and the Q&A box. So whichever one you choose, we will try to get to you. And then we'll take the last few minutes just to talk about our next steps. And there's 3 more webinars coming with other recommendations from the playbook. So with that, Andrew Peterson, who is our fearless leader, coordinating all of the work that we've been doing, is going to be running the Q&A, and I'll try to help move things along as we go. Andrew?
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Stephanie, DJ, and Sylvia for being a part of this and for your kind of wonderful presentations on each part of the playbook. You know, it's been fantastic to work with each of you all throughout this process, and we're just really glad to have you on and talking about what we think is a really important effort. The first question we received was talking about public-private partnerships, and you know, how does the pandemic kind of impact and change, I guess, you know, that financing structure, and what kind of new P3s might we be seeing, kind of given the situation we're in now economically. And the DJ might want to take that first, and then we can kind of pass it around.
Thank you, Andrew. I'd be happy to jump on that one. Yeah, I mean, so unfortunately, the pandemic is, as Ms. Wiggins pointed out, reduces revenue that's going to be available to local communities. To the extent there's any silver lining in the situation we find ourselves in, it is that public-private partnerships, and in particular pre-development agreements, which Sylvia had touched on as part of her presentation, can be helpful in terms of allowing states and communities to develop infrastructure currently. We just finished a paper called Bridge the Dip that talks about the fact that in an economic slowdown, the costs of design, the cost of this construction, the cost of O&M typically will drop. And so if there is core infrastructure the community needs, now is actually a pretty good time to plan for it. The challenge is, how do you find resources to do that planning? I think part of the answer to that would be pre-development agreement. It's one of the PPP models that allows governments to use private sector funding to pay for the early development process of a project, so we can get to that shovel-worthy project that Sylvia was talking about.
The other thing that I would add on that question with public-private partnerships, I think we're seeing, I think, as DJ mentioned with TIFIA and other programs, we've seen kind of historic projects on the road side of the house. I think there's some opportunity for some social infrastructure being a bigger part of the conversation when it comes to public-private partnerships. I think in general, you're always looking for either expertise or mitigating risk when you're looking at a public-private partnership. What does the private sector bring to the table? And I think in this moment, there's an opportunity to think differently about everything. And so I think there's some opportunities to think innovatively about how you bring that public sector desire that Mayor Benjamin was talking about of what's the need, but then where can the expertise or cost savings or other things that the private sector bring be beneficial to kind of broaden that scope of what we think about with public-private partnerships. I know in particular when we were putting together the playbook, there was a lot of conversation about broadband and water and some of those other elements that have had a little less success on that partnership side, but I think there's some lessons learned that can be brought to that conversation.
Great, let's go to the next question, Andrew.
We just received another question talking about, or asking, I should say, in what strategic ways do municipalities look to conduct surveying of local community populations as different regions see economic prosperity with subjective perspectives? So I think it's kind of really getting at how do municipalities or agencies really engage with their communities to best understand needs. I think Stephanie, given your presentation, might be a great panelist to open this one.
Well, ironically, I think this pandemic has highlighted the importance of broadband and being able to engage with the community virtually. I think one of the practitioners I was talking to last week talked about how if we enabled broadband in every community, you're really enabling democracy because we're able to engage more with the public, more so than ever before. So you saw transit agencies being creative and using their buses as mobile hotspots in communities where they were not broadband rich. It helps with better engagement. Obviously, we continue to do telephone surveys. Ironically, the market research firms are saying in the stay-at-home environment, more people are willing to answer the phone because they're tired of talking to their significant other or they want an adult other than the kids. So we've been getting really great quality market research through the phone. We get our seniors that way. Telephone town halls are phenomenal. They were phenomenal pre-pandemic. They're even more needed now. But again, leveraging the technology and connecting with the general public is so important. We have been conducting surveys over the last couple of months of our riders and non-riders, and being able to hear directly from them is critical as we develop our recovery plans for the future.
Okay, Andrew, let's go to the next one.
Yeah. We received a question from Mike talking about which recommendation in the playbook is most critical to contributing to equality in cities. I might toss this to Sylvia, but maybe rephrase a little bit, just kind of how did we, when we went about developing this playbook, did we really think about equity issues, particularly given where we are now as a country? How did that make its way into, I don't know, there's probably not one that maybe stands out as the most important one of this issue, but I think it was a lens that we really looked at the playbook throughout. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, Sylvia.
Sure, happy to. And I think Stephanie probably has a lot to contribute on this one too, because I know when we were having the conversations, she was the one that inspired me the most with her thoughts on how do we integrate some of these racial equity questions right into the heart of infrastructure. So I know this is the funding and finance discussion, but I think there was a lot of discussion about workforce and hiring and some of those elements where I think those were just very core to what we're looking at for the recommendations. In those, we really talked a lot about how do you build career paths, a pipeline of individuals, and making sure that when you're looking at projects, you think about how you're serving the community around it. It's not just about that infrastructure project. It's about the people that work there. It's the people that ride on whatever type of infrastructure, transportation infrastructure it is, or utilize the service. I think it was really important. But I think to your point, Andrew, I think this was something that we were very deliberate about, and made sure that each recommendation, we looked at it and thought about what's the equity lens that we could be adding to this recommendation. How do we think about that? And how do we make sure that that's incorporated in each recommendation? And I think part of the recommendation I talked about today with the pre-development, a lot of that is hoping that local governments will be having those conversations about what makes the most sense to advance equity in my city, and giving you some planning dollars and some capacity building and technical assistance that help make those projects that make a difference move forward. So I think in each one, we tried to find something to make sure that we're including that. I think some like workforce are more clear, but I think across the board, making sure that we're meeting this moment and we're not continuing some of the inequities that were created through infrastructure in the past, but thinking about how do you right size infrastructure, and really how do you make sure you're having a positive impact on the communities and people that it serves.
Yeah, I think Sylvia hit it right out of the park. I definitely believe that, as Mayor Benjamin was saying, that this is opportunity to humanize the infrastructure, and all of these recommendations do that. And if you develop these recommendations with that in mind, that is organic to an equity lens. So I think all of them are necessary and needed.
We have another question here. So I think I'll direct to DJ. I'm just going to go around to each of you, I think. This one's talking about kind of from an economic recovery standpoint, the benefits of grants versus loans. And the comment is loans not being feasible during the pandemic, where municipalities are losing sales tax and other revenues. Do you mind commenting on kind of what role loans might have, or kind of other financing mechanisms compared to just grants to the government?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And from a federal government perspective, right, it's probably better to do loans than to grants, because you get paid back, which doesn't happen with a grant, and also that you're ensuring that there's more sort of skin in the game in part to your local partner. Now, the point that's made by the questioner, which is, okay, well, you're in a pandemic and there are limited local funds. That's absolutely true, but we're also in a pandemic, and there's likely to be limited federal funds unless we continue borrowing at the rate we're borrowing. So the point is, how do you find that balance between the two? The other benefit to loans is that they tend to be less prescriptive. I mean, they have to follow federal guidelines, but there's less federal oversight typically of loan amounts than there are grants. So I think if the answer is loan or grant, if you're on the recipient side, obviously you always want a grant, right? Because that makes all the sense in the world. Why would I not take free money? But the benefit from, as I mentioned in my remarks, the benefit of the loan program like TIFIA is for $1 federal dollar, you can get $30 worth of project, right, on a loan. And that part of that is a little bit of budget gimmickry, so we'll put an asterisk by that, but that is the federal accounting, so we'll take it since they're giving it to us. Whereas if you have $1 federal dollar in a grant, you get $1 worth of project, or if there's a match requirement, you get $1.25. So if you're looking for federal participation in a large number of projects, and you're looking for projects, particularly public-private partnership projects, they're kind of on the cusp and they're viable, but they need something else to help lower their cost of capital, then TIFIA and PABs are incredibly powerful and very potent.
Well, I can imagine that there would probably be some folks that would emphasize the point that from the recipient's perspective, the grant is better than the loan, particularly during the pandemic. But does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to DJ's analogy of the credit card, right? Like, I think we'd all rather have, I can't remember the amount you said, but if you have a 10,000 line of credit or a check from your wealthy, relative, of course you want the check as opposed to the credit card. And I think, I think DJ and I have a long history of having to explain this in our days at USDOT of the difference between funding and financing, right? I think a lot of times people use them interchangeably. And I think that underlying as a recipient, you always want the federal money. I think there's the question of how limited resources and how much is available to go around, I think is always the question. But I think one of the things that we tried to do in the playbook was trying to make sure that those limited resources that are grants, trying to make them a little bit more flexible and responsive on the local level, I think was a big part of that conversation. And I think DJ talked about the financing side of it and how we're trying to make that more flexible. But I think in general, it's always about how do you make every dollar go farther in a limited resource world.
Sure. And I believe the questioner also asked what the playbook recommended, loans versus grants. So I'll say, read the playbook. No, it's ready for you. And because it's 4:26 Eastern, Andrew, I'm gonna keep it moving along, okay? And thank you for doing the questions and answers, and thank you to all of the panelists. We're going to just close out real quick with, let me make sure I got so excited I don't know if I was ready to share my screen. We're just going to close out with our next steps. We want to make sure everyone knows that the playbook is not a document to be used to keep a door wedged open. We're using this actively. We hope you do read the book and connect with us. It's very, very easy to go through. Next, we're going to be weighing in, and we are, on COVID-19 relief. There's apparently maybe some progress this week, and on the reauthorization of the FAST Act. And we'll be working with federal legislators and policymakers. So to learn more, please visit acceleratorforamerica.org/infrastructure. I'm sorry, infrastructure-partnership. And also, we have 3 more webinars in this series. I hope you found it useful. I noticed that people did not drop off, so I'm glad to see that we have a lot of participation today. And I'm sorry we couldn't answer everyone's questions, but please keep the questions coming to us. The next webinar next week, same time, will be on Project Acceleration, which is near and dear to my heart, and it will be starring Mayor Nan Whaley from Dayton, Ohio, and we have a number of other really fantastic panelists. As you can see from this group today, we have some terrific speakers. So I hope you'll join us for that one. And then finally, for more information, please contact us. There's 2 websites there, both acecresearchinstitute.org and Accelerator for America has ways to reach us and to read a little bit more about the new Partnership for Infrastructure. I hope that many of the folks on this group will join the partnership. And with that, I believe our time is up. So we hope to see you next week. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.